Hello, this is a tale for Halloween. It's by R Chetwynd-Hayes from his collection The Monster Club, and it's entitled The Humgoo. Gerald Mansfield was lost, a not unusual occurrence, being the kind of person who has no sense of location. He knew he was somewhere in Hampshire, that Portsmouth lay possibly 30 miles or so to the south, that he was driving through narrow lanes, having turned off the main road whilst suffering under the illusion that this would cut short his journey. Suddenly, he saw the sign, a long white plaque with embossed black letters which stated quite clearly Loughville. Gerald thought of a petrol station. The tank was nearly empty. A restaurant, his stomach being in like condition, and some intelligent person who could put him back on the shortest route to Portsmouth. At first glance, Loughville looked promising. A narrow main street lined on either side by terraced houses, and what appeared to be a pub backed by an old church at the far end. But when Gerald examined his surroundings more carefully, he found a general atmosphere of age and neglect. The cottages were not only old but decrepit, with crumbling mortar and flaking paint, while the tiny front gardens displayed tall grass and wild flowers, which was in keeping with the tumble-down gates and reeling fences. He might have supposed the place to be deserted, were it not for the occasional plume of smoke that drifted up from almost every chimney, and the thick and dirty net curtains that masked every window. As his car crept down the street, he had a suspicion that some curtains stirred, as though a ripple of interest had roused the houses from an afternoon nap. And there was no doubt at all that one door opened very slightly, thus allowing a single cold eye to peer around the edge. Gerald drove into a narrow courtyard which lay before the inn, and looked up at the building that could have been mistaken for another cottage, were it not for the dilapidated sign which hung over the solitary green-painted door. This depicted a man in what appeared to be a white smock, and immediately below was the inscription, "The Lough Inn." Gerald got out of his car, crossed the drive, and after some hesitation, opened the green door. He entered a long, evil-smelling room and looked round with some surprise. A plain, unvarnished counter ran three-quarters of the length of the room and terminated where a flight of stairs led to the upper regions. A large beer barrel stood at the right end of the bar, and the countertop was littered with a number of earthenware mugs. Two oak settles flanked an old-fashioned fireplace, and a long, backless bench stood against the wall on either side of the door. The floor was coated with filthy sawdust. There were no decorations of any kind, no advertisements, which even the meanest of inns usually displays. Nothing but bare essentials. Gerald approached the bar, and as there was no one in attendance, rapped smartly on the stained counter. He waited for a full minute, then rapped again and looked expectantly at a ragged curtain which masked an open doorway set in the facing wall. Presently, this stirred. A long-fingered and extremely dirty hand pulled it slowly to one side, and a tall, lean man emerged into view. He shuffled to the counter and stared at the visitor with mouth-gaping astonishment. Gerald decided that here was an individual he would not care to meet on a dark night. The face was unnaturally long and narrow. The eyelids were hooded and hung down over the watery eyes as clusters of wrinkled skin. Excessively large ears stood up on either side of the completely bald head. A hooked nose jutted out over a mouth which, being open, revealed yellow, pointed teeth. He was dressed, if that was the right word, in what Gerald could only suppose to be a suit of filthy, striped pyjamas. The young man tried to veil his repulsion by a nervous smile and a polite voice. I wonder if you could help me. I seem to be lost. I was driving to Portsmouth and...
You come by
Motor car? The question was asked in a thick, slurred voice, which suggested its owner had either a vocal cord ailment or mucus-filled bronchial tubes. At the same time, the watery eyes, insofar as they were capable of expression, gleamed with pleasurable surprise. You come by motor car from outside. Gerald frowned and considered the possibility of backing towards the door. Yes, I've driven down from London and intended to be in Portsmouth before nightfall. But as I said, I seem to have lost my way. I was hoping you could direct me back to the main road. The man nodded, a very slow jerking of his head, then, as though struck by a sudden thought, turned and shuffled back to the doorway. Gerald heard him mutter something in a low, growling voice, and almost at once a child dashed from behind the curtain, and, after ducking under the bar, stood upright for a few moments, gazing up at the visitor with the same open-mouthed astonishment that decorated the face of the innkeeper. Gerald could not determine the child's sex, for the skinny body was attired in the remains of a little girl's nightgown, but there was certainly nothing feminine about the long, narrow head that was surmounted by a mass of tangled black hair. The innkeeper growled again, and the child sped for the door, which Gerald had thoughtlessly left open. "Send her someone," the man intoned. "Someone who direct." Very, very kind," Gerald murmured, then added, "But I've no wish to cause trouble, I dare say. If I keep going, I'll find a main road somewhere." "Someone direct," the man repeated. "Have beer." "Yes, well, that's an idea. I'll have half a pint." The innkeeper, with the same slow movement which seemed to dominate all his actions, took up an earthenware mug and, after shuffling along the entire length of the bar, held it under the beer barrel and turned a spigot. When Gerald tasted the liquid, he found it to be both bitter and strong. "Home-brewed?" he inquired. "Make it ourselves," the man growled. "Oh, then you are a free house." The question seemed to confuse the innkeeper, for he again assumed an expression of open-mouthed astonishment and did not answer. Gerald emptied the mug, then looked with pretended impatience at his watch. "Look here, I don't think I'll bother to wait for your friend. I'll push along and hope for the best." "They come now," the man said. And indeed, barely had Gerald time to note that singular had been transformed into multiple, when a large number of persons filed in through the doorway and formed a half circle in front of the bar. The child, being the last to enter, slammed the door, then hastened to join its elders, who were staring at the stranger with disconcerted interest. They all bore an uncanny resemblance to the innkeeper. Same long, narrow heads, identical large ears and hooded eyes, but a few were endowed with a mop of tangled, greasy hair. Gerald could not avoid the impression that he had caused them all to rise from a loathsome and unsavoury bed. Filthy and torn pyjamas of every colour and design predominated. Flannel nightgowns took second place, and one tall, lanky creature was wrapped in what appeared to be a badly stained bedsheet. "Gentlemen lust," announced the innkeeper. "Ah!" the tall, lanky one ejaculated, and his Adam's apple went up and down as though it had been motivated by some intense excitement. "Come by motor car," the innkeeper added, and instantly two members of the assembly shuffled towards the door. "Where be ye bound for?" inquired a short thing in a spotted nightgown. "Portsmouth," the innkeeper answered. Gerald, like a man lost in a particularly unpleasant nightmare, watched an awful nodding of heads. It was a slow nodding which might have suggested that a very simple problem had been solved.
"I reckon that be a goodish way off,"
announced something in greenish pyjamas.
"Reckon he won't get there tonight,"
stated the man in the once white sheet.
"Or tomorrow,"
added the innkeeper. They all tittered, a kind of low, gurgling giggle, such as a crowd of evil backward children might make, while anticipating the result of an unpleasant practical joke. It was at this point that the door opened and the two persons who had gone out returned. Gerald gathered up his shattered courage and made a statement. "Thank you for all your kind interest, but I must leave now. Don't worry, I'll find my way somehow."
"He be leaving,"
said the tall, lanky one with an expression of profound astonishment.
"Leaving?"
inquired the innkeeper.
Arr.
"Well," Gerald managed to grin, "I'll be on my way. Thanks again." He strode purposefully towards the door, and the half-circle obligingly parted in the centre, and allowed him to pass. He reached the door, opened it, and, feeling like a man who has, against all expectations, been released from prison, stepped out into the dying afternoon. He all but ran to his car, as though it were a refuge that would protect him from all danger, or a bastion from which he could fight off a horde of grotesque attackers. But when he was safely inside, the door closed and the ignition switched on. He saw them clustered round the inn door, watching him with amused interest. Before he pressed the self-starter, he actually waved to them, hoping that this would be accepted as a gesture of cheerful unconcern. No one bothered to wave back. Neither did the self-starter respond to the urgent pressure of his foot. The continued silence, which could have been broken by the comforting roar of the engine, made his heart thump, and he pressed his foot down until it seemed it must go through the floorboards, but to no avail. The sideways glance told him the line of night-attired figures was very slowly advancing. Only now the hooded eyes were alight with malicious pleasure, and the child was dancing as though in anticipation of some unexpected treat. Gerald had no alternative but to climb out and walk with assumed unconcern round to the front of the car. He raised the bonnet, and the reason for the self-starter's non-cooperation became instantly apparent. The distributor had been smashed and every bit of wiring pulled out. Uneasiness, active fear had not yet crossed the border, was temporarily swept away by a hot surge of rage. "Who did this?" he bellowed at the now stationary but interested audience.
"Be it broke?"
asked the innkeeper. "Of course it's bloody well broke. Who did it?" One white face looked at another in a parody of helpless inquiry. Then the tall, lanky one expressed an opinion.
"Be them vermin. I lay it be them vermin."
Then something in greenish pyjamas nodded with awful solemnity.
"Real monsters they be. Nothing be safe."
Gerald's rage evaporated, and fear was willing and ready to fill its place. He looked hopefully up and down the road, then proceeded to ask what proved to be a silly question. "Can anyone direct me to the nearest telephone?"
"No telephone.
No telephone. No telephone." The tortured words rumbled mournfully along the line, then dropped down to the child who, lacking his elder's histrionic power, repeated them as a cry of triumph. "No telephone!" How far is it to the nearest garage?" The same inquiring looks were exchanged, but now heads were shaken, and the innkeeper, who seemed to exercise some kind of authority, murmured, "Garage. No garage." "For heaven's sakes!" Gerald looked anxiously from side to side. "Surely you can suggest something. What can I do?" They all spoke in unison.
"Stay here! Stay here!" yelled the child. "Soon be dark," said one. "'Tain't safe in dark," said another. "Me snagging pa," comforted yet another.
Dirty white fingers plucked at his coat sleeves, an elbow prodded his back, and Gerald was half led, half forced back into the loft inn. Gerald was given a room with an excellent view of the churchyard. After a swift glance, which evoked an involuntary shudder, he released the dust-grimed curtain and examined the room in which he was expected to spend the night. Like the bar, no effort had been wasted on non-essentials. A narrow wooden bedstead on which lay a rumpled pile of bedclothes, a battered toolboy with tantalisingly familiar brass handles, and a wooden chair. The floor was bare, faded wallpaper hung in drapes from crumbling plaster, while festoons of cobwebs decorated the cracked ceiling. Gerald decided there would be no communication between himself and the bed, and if he must spend the night in this room, the chair would be his only resting place. Even as he reached this decision, the door opened and a girl entered. She was as a diamond among pebbles. Or perhaps a better simile would be a lamb among wolves. Her face was long, but not so unnaturally long. Her eyes large and a deep cornflower blue, which contrasted with her shoulder-length black hair. She was dressed in a comparatively white nightgown, and gave the impression that, unlike her associates, she was at least on nodding terms with soap and water. Gerald gaped at this beauty that had so unexpectedly emerged from the grotesque, and watched her place a tray on the edge of the bed. She spoke with the same husky voice that seemed characteristic of the entire village, but it lacked that horrible gurgling quality.
"Dadder say you eat this."
He looked at the basin of brown stew from which lumps of meat jutted out like rocks in a calm sea, and wondered if his stomach would accept anything that had been cooked in this dirt-ridden place. What is it?" he inquired. She smiled, and her teeth were even and white.
"Stew rabbit, I cook."
He looked, sniffed, and after taking up a battered dessert spoon, finally tasted.
"It's not bad."
The stomach held a conference with appetite and decided to accept the rabbit stew. The girl watched him eat. Then, when the basin was empty, she timidly put out a hand and felt the soft texture over his camel hair suit.
"Good. Do all people on outside wear this?"
Outside? For a moment he thought that she had made some kind of obscure joke, or that this was a clumsy attempt to start a flirtatious conversation. Then he saw the wonderment in the blue eyes, and fear, which was never far away, came rushing back. "Look, you are only a few miles from the main road. An hour's ride in my car will take you to a large town. This isn't the North Pole." She shook her head.
"I do not understand. Long ago the elders set a gulf between them and us. Only once in many eatings has strangers from outside come through. No one but elders go out."
A theory formed from the mass of jumbled words that bedevilled his mind, giving a rational explanation for all he had seen and heard. The small community that had interbred for generations and now was but a collection of semi-idiots who had lost track with reality. That must be the answer, and this girl was a throwback, a misfit who had accepted the superstitions and legends that had been passed down and elaborated on by crippled minds. He felt a twinge of pity. "All people," he paused, then tried again. "All people on the outside wear clothes like mine.
But girls wear prettier ones, and you should too. Tell me, why are you all dressed in night clothes? Surely you must be cold during the winter time. These are only clothes in boxes, she stated simply. No clothes like yours, only this, she pointed to her nightgown, and others like Dada's. Boxes? He frowned and tried to understand. You mean you found some boxes filled with nightgowns and pyjamas? She shook her head. No, only one clothes in each box. All comes from boxes. She nodded towards the chest of drawers with the brass handles. Dickon, who worked with hands, made that from boxes. Bed from boxes. Chair made from boxes. Gerald looked at the tall boy with renewed interest. It had been constructed from polished elm and fitted with brass handles that were still tantalisingly familiar. The workmanship was crude, for he could see hammer marks where the craftsman had missed his aim, and no attempt had been made to remove the numerous stains and scratches. Where did your people find these boxes? She nodded towards the window. In ground, on gathering night. All comes from boxes. Clothes, wood, food, for big eating. Almost against his will, Gerald moved over to the window and looked down onto the churchyard. There was the church, grey, forlorn, with broken windows and gaping doorway, and there was a rugged crop of reeling tombstones that looked as if they had lost a long battle with a raging typhoon. But instead of graves were row after row of earth piles and yawning holes. The girl's voice came from behind his left shoulder. No more boxes there. All gone. Gerald turned and for a thought-frozen moment stood, looking down at the white, beautiful face. Then, when understanding wriggled into his mind like a bad-intentioned snake, he sprang into violent and purposeful action. He reached the door in 3 running strides. The innkeeper watched him pass with his habitual look of profound astonishment. 3 night-clad creatures who were propping up the inn wall raised their heads as he stood in the narrow courtyard and looked anxiously from side to side. The car had disappeared. There had been some wild notion of doing some running repairs, or at the very worst locking himself in. But now even these frail dreams had evaporated and merged into the stream of cold despair. There was only one recourse: to keep running. He ran down the road that skirted the church and disappeared under the archway of trees. He ran until it seemed his heart must burst, and the most glorious pleasure would be to lie down in the tall grass and let his soul float away on the cool breeze. Eventually he stopped and looked back. No one had either been able or could be bothered to follow him. He remembered those slow-moving figures and gave a loud sigh of relief. He had now only to follow his nose, and sooner or later he would reach a main road. Or, at the very least, a telephone. He walked for an hour. The road twisted, did a complete turn, ran between untilled fields, turned again, slid under an avenue of interlocking trees, and Gerald found himself back in the village. He mastered a wave of near panic and decided that if the road was not to be trusted, he would take to the open fields. He climbed a low bank, wended his way from tree to tree, and presently came out into a large open space that rose gradually to a far-off crest. As he walked, Gerald had the silly notion that he was getting nowhere. Almost as if, and this was even more silly, the ground was moving and he was marking time. The notion appeared to have some substance when he crested the slope, for way down below lay the desecrated churchyard and the twin lines of huddled cottages that, at this distance, looked like 2 long brown caterpillars on either side of a grey ribbon. Gerald Mansfield wandered for the rest of the day.
He walked away from the sun. He walked towards it. He crashed through overgrown hedges, jumped waterlogged ditches, waded through waist-high grass, crossed the road several times, and always came back to the village. The sun was setting when he reeled into the main, the only, street for the last time, and they were waiting for him. Nice work? The tall, lanky one inquired. Bangladesh distance? Asked the thing in green pyjamas. 8 time, announced the creature wrapped in a bedsheet. Hot rabbit stew, promised the innkeeper. He was escorted back to that awful bedroom. The door was shut and bolted on the outside, and there followed the simple peace that follows a complete defeat. Gerald was so tired he actually flung himself down on the bed, but did not, of course, attempt to climb between the sheets. Apart from other considerations, there was an exciting suspicion that they had been made from a well-used shroud. It was dark when the door opened, and the girl, holding a candle in one hand and a tray in the other, entered the room. Gerald sat up and blinked at her. He had no idea how long he had been asleep, but his body was refreshed, if somewhat stiff, and his brain fully receptive. Horror rode in on the back of memory, but Gerald tried to ignore it. Fear would freeze his mind, paralyse his reasoning powers, and therefore destroy any faint hope that this pretty young thing could be made to render assistance. He smiled with assumed cheerfulness as she laid the tray on the bed and pointed to the steaming basin. "Rabbit stew again?" he inquired. She shrugged. "Box is empty. We have to make do." He shuddered, although he could not really believe that the nightmare of medieval mythology could become stark reality. There must be another answer. The girl seated herself on the only chair and watched him eat, and because curiosity would not be denied, he had to ask questions. "You are different from the others. Do you know why?" "My mother outside her. When I born, she got into box, then dug up for great eating, all happy." Gerald put the half-empty basin down and did not wonder why his appetite had fled. He began to speak quickly, the words tumbling over one another in a vain effort to dislodge terror and re-establish reason. "This is some kind of a game, isn't it? People, cars, they must come through. It's impossible to think otherwise. If what you expect me to believe is true, then beauty, the commonplace, all is only a brightly coloured veil which hides the horrific. Why, God in heaven, the entire world is but a pretty ball pleasing on the outside, a mass of seething maggots on the inner." "Not understand," she shook her head. "Sometimes elders come in on day of great eating, and there is much dancing round fire. They bring in boxes." A tiny spark of hope flickered across the darkness of his despair. "Then someone does come in. Tell me, please think carefully, when is day of great eating?" She was looking aimlessly out of the window, and Gerald wondered if he were beginning to frighten her with all these questions. She answered him in a low voice. "When night light is big ball over big house." "Big ball? Nightlight?" His brain played with this imagery, tossed words to and fro, and came up with the simple answer. "When the full moon is over the church? Tell me, what is your name?" "Name?" She frowned and stirred uneasily, and he knew that he would not retain her much longer. "You mean how am I called?" "Luna." "Then, Luna, can you remember how these, what do you call them, how these elders come? Do they walk?" She giggled. It was the first natural girlish sound she had made, and it seemed she was a little nearer to him because of it.
"No, elders come in motor car, big motor car."
He leaned towards her, and she did not shrink away. "One more question, Luna. I promise, just one more. You said your mother was an outsider. How did she get in? Did she come in? Did she come with the elders?" Again that childish shaking of head.
"No. Dada say she caught in trap. Like rabbit. Like you and motor car. Trap not catch many. Last 10 great eatings ago."
"Luna, what will they do with me?"
"You say only one more question."
She got up and moved towards the door, and it was then that the cords of reason snapped, and he was clutching her arm, pouring out his terrible words. "Luna, tell me, in the name of mercy, tell me, what will they do with me?" She was writhing in his grasp, struggling to break free, and her beautiful eyes were wild with alarm.
"May not tell, Dada bait me if I tell."
"He will never know, I promise, but I must know. Please tell me and I will let you go." Luna became quieter. Then she turned her head and whispered, as though afraid that the paper-draped walls might overhear the dread secret.
"You wear clothes like this."
She pointed with her free hand at the nightgown.
"Then you go into box and bury in ground near big house. And when night light round, they dig you up. And there will be great tearing and eating."
Gerald's hand dropped away, and Luna, finding she was free, slipped out through the half-open door and slowly bolted it behind her. Gerald paced the room, clasped his head between his shaking hands, and tried to come to terms with truth as he saw it. One fact was certain: he was in the hands of imbeciles with a mania that included murder, and he might as well face the fact, eating their victims afterwards. Luna's last words raced across his brain.
"And there will be great tearing and eating."
He went to the window and looked down. A drop of at least 20 feet, and it would not be pleasant if he were to break a leg and be helpless to move when they came for him. But the bedclothes. He could make some sort of rope from them, and surely if he tried really hard, he must find a way back to the main road. It would be a great help if he knew where he was. Then he remembered the road map in his jacket pocket. He spread it out on the bed, and by the light cast by the glittering candle, anxiously studied the meandering lines that denoted roads and tried to pinpoint the position where he had turned off. "I passed that roundabout," he spoke aloud. "Yes, and that farm. So," he jabbed his finger down, "here is where I turned. It must be. The only side road for miles. That being the case, where the devil is Loughville?" His finger followed the line of the road and came to a space of open countryside and woodland. He widened his search area and muttered the names as they came within his line of vision. Cohampton, Wickham, Tapnedge, Farnham, but no Loughville. Then, desperate for a straw of hope, hungry for a crumb of reality, he grabbed at the improbable. Perhaps the map makers had spelt the name wrongly, or there was a misprint. Supposing there was a G where an L should be, or an O in place of a U. Treat the name as an anagram and see what you come up with, Gerald thought hard. Hoogleville. No. Oogleville. Extremely unlikely. Then he exchanged one letter for another and stared with bulging eyes and gaping mouth at the result. Gouville. Gaulville. The place of the Gauls. Had he been in another situation, Gerald would have laughed most heartily at this macabre joke. He would most likely have experimented with a few more place names and possibly have come up with one or more bizarre results. Good heavens, the anagram of Slough was Gauls. Was it possible? The arm of coincidence could not be that long. He was in the hands of Gauls. The sheets, or shrouds, were made from tough, unbleached linen, and had it not been for his penknife, he would never have been able to tear them into long strips. The rest was easy. 5 minutes later found him with a reasonably strong knotted rope, which would more than reach to the ground. He pulled up the bedstead to the window, tied one end of his rope over the footboard and tossed the other out of the window. Then he prepared to climb down and found the task more difficult than he had supposed. A bedstead made from coffin boards was not very heavy, and the instant Gerald slid over the windowsill, the footboard left the floor and came crashing through the window frame. This meant he was jerked out from the wall and was left hanging like a hooked fish over a patch of unkempt back garden. By a dint of sliding and going down hand over hand, he finally reached the ground and prepared to set up an all-time record for the 100-yard sprint. It was then that he found that his labour and ingenuity had been completely wasted. They moved in from both sides. Pyjamas, nightgowns, shrouds, faces faintly phosphorescent in the semi-darkness. 24 or more nightmare figures shuffled in, bringing their gurgling voices with them. "That were a goodish drop," Long and Lanky stated. "He made her fine old mutt out of your window," observed Greenish Pyjamas. "I reckon he be going for work again," Bedsheet suggested. "What do you reckon we ought to do with him?" inquired the innkeeper. "Coffin him!" shouted a shrill voice that was very near the ground. The suggestion found favour with an overall majority, less one. Whatever courage Gerald still retained melted when cold, seemingly boneless hands grabbed his arms, caressed his neck, embraced his thighs and ankles, and he was frog-marched round the inn and through the front door. His screams caused a certain amount of low, throaty laughter, and the child, whom he had come to dread more than the full-grown, slobbering adults, took full advantage of his helpless condition to poke him in the ribs, scream in his ear, and bite his writhing fingers. They passed him over the bar, and here there was a little ill-intentioned horseplay. Pulling of arms, twisting of legs. Through the curtained doorway and into a small room beyond, all had been prepared. The coffin was not one to be proud of. It was old, earth-caked, the wood cracked here and there, but for the lack of something better, still serviceable. Gerald was undressed with the greatest of care, for even he could appreciate that this wardrobe was of inestimable value, and when shared would replace worn-out pyjamas, nightgown or shroud. When he was naked, they all gathered round and drooled. He was the uncooked joint, the peeled potatoes and washed greens, the plum pudding or apple tart. And there was clearly a great hunger for food. Fingers clawed his bare leg, pointed teeth were bared, but Luna screamed out the merciful words, "Don't tear! He not dead yet!" Like the coffin, the nightgown had seen better days. Stained with unthinkable splodges, torn, smelly, but it fitted where it touched. They bound him with coffin-lowering ropes, then with surprising gentleness laid him in the coffin. Dinner was now ready for the cold oven. As the coffin lid was lowered, he saw the circle of open-mouthed, hooded-eyed faces that were all dribbling, gloating, lip-licking, save one. If hope still lived, it lay hidden in a pair of cornflower blue eyes that wept. 2 large tears were creeping down the white cheeks. When the light was blotted out and he was shut in. Age is sometimes ugly. It can also be spiteful, malicious, or downright cruel. It can also, on occasion, be kind. Age had robbed the coffin of its former polished sheen, warped its wooden planks, tarnished its brass handles, but it had also given it some long, gaping cracks, and these enabled Gerald to breathe. He could also hear, which was not quite so fortunate.
Bury him now. Aye, then he be nice and ripe for great eating. I fancy leg myself rare and tender, babe. But be tasty.
The voice of the innkeeper had an authoritative ring.
Get him planted first. Then when night be big, we tear and eat.
Gerald found himself being lifted up, and there was a general swaying which was occasionally disturbed by a violent bump. Then, when the coffin made contact with doorpost or bar, then the night breeze seeped in through the cracks, and he knew he was on his way to the churchyard. There was no burial service, and really he did not expect one. For what housewife says a prayer when she drops the steak into a pie dish? Just an ungentle lowering into a second-hand grave. Then, and it was now that Gerald learned to pray, the hurried shoveling of loose earth that crashed down on the coffin lid like rocks on a drum. He tried to resign himself to death, but the body was young and healthy and it wanted to live, and the brain gave a great cry of terror when it saw the black rolling plains that lay ahead. Gerald arched his bound legs and his knees smashed up against the coffin's lid. Again age came to his assistance, for the wood was rotten and broke easily, rearing up through the loose earth and jagged splinters, so that his supply of air was reinforced by means of a narrow tunnel. Gerald held his breath, terrified lest the noise had attracted the attention of his grave fillers. But it must have been masked by the sound of falling earth, for the shovelling continued without interruption, and he increased his upward pressure when a trickle of earth seeped down into the coffin. Presently the by now faint thudding ceased, and after waiting for as long as he dared, Gerald pressed his head against the coffin lid and was rewarded a soft, popping sound as corroded screws flew from enlarged holes, plus the knowledge that the loose earth was giving way above him. Fortunately, his burial had been more symbolic than actual, for those who put him down had every intention of shortly bringing him back up again, and Gauls were not apparently addicted to hard work. Spluttering, sweating, with scratched face and soil-caked hair, Gerald Mansfield came up from his grave and looked anxiously round the deserted churchyard. The moon, which was but a nibble away from being full, lit up the Gothic scene. Highlighted the grey stone church, the desecrated graves and reeling tombstones. The night breeze came rustling across the tall grass and made the young man shiver. By a miracle he was free from his coffin, but his position still bordered on the hopeless. Clad in a nightgown and trussed up like a roasting fowl, it would take all his strength and ingenuity to climb out of the grave, let alone put distance between himself and the sinister village. His head was just above ground level, but by leaning against the grave wall he was able to draw his feet up and stand on one side of the coffin. Then followed 10 minutes of wriggling, heaving and kicking the loose earth downwards until he was able to at last roll over onto solid ground. He lay still for some time and gradually regained his breath and strength. Then he looked up and all but slid back into the grave. A white figure was wending its way between the tombstones towards him. Fear chased thoughts round into a mad circle, and despair looked down from the night sky. One of them was coming back to finish the grave-filling operation, or perhaps the noise he had made when breaking out of the coffin had been heard and its implications only just realised. Gerald buried his face in the coarse grass and, overcome by weakness, shock and cold terror, cried. He heard the slow footsteps draw nearer and waited for the clutch of flabby fingers and the harsh cry of a gurgling voice. The footsteps ceased when they had reached a spot but a few inches from his shaking head, and a low voice said, "You get out. We're afraid you not get out." It was some time before Gerald dared to look up, and when he did, it was hard to believe that fortune still smiled upon him. Luna stood looking down at him, a gleaming carving knife in one hand, a spade in the other. When she bent over him with an outstretched knife, he shrank back with a little cry. She looked anxiously over one shoulder. "No make noise, I cut loose." She hacked at the confining ropes, and when they had fallen away, he still did not move, but lay staring up at her with wide eyes. Luna sat down beside him and looked sadly at the open graves. "I could not let them do this to you. Others old and fat and squeal like trapped rabbit, but you different. We feel sadness for you." Gerald sat up, and he felt pity, even tenderness, for this lovely creature who belonged neither to monster world or human. But fear, the urgent demand for self-preservation, left no room for gentle emotion. He could only ask the all-important question. "Where can I hide?" Luna pointed to the moonlit church. "In big house. They not go there. It is not good. They fall down if go in there." The old grey building with its broken windows and sagging doors was at once a place of sanctuary, a mecca for the hunted, a resting place where hope could be reborn. He laid his hand on the girl's arm, and she started as though his touch were a branding iron. "Can you go in there?" She nodded. "Yes, I am not as them. Dada say I am Humgoo. I have mother's blood. I too would go into ground, but Dada chief and elder say I be left alone." "How long must I stay there?" he asked. "I not know. I bring you food when others not watch, but must be careful." She shuddered and again looked fearfully back at the inn. "They must not know, or I suffer bad things." "I'll go into the church now," he said, "and thank you. He rose, and there was a fleeting thought that he should reward her bravery with a light kiss, but the shuddering suspicion of what food had passed those full red lips, and what tasks had been performed by the long white fingers, made him draw back. Without so much as a backward glance, he ran towards the church and left her standing like a pathetic white ghost among the dejected tombstones. Time had breathed upon pews, floor, and altar, and left behind a thick coating of dust which sometimes stirred when a breeze slid in through the gaping windows and rose up as nebulous spirals that drifted across deserted aisle and desolate chancel. Giant cobwebs hung from the roof and window frames, and Gerald occasionally heard the twitter of a sleeping bird that had nested high up among the shadowy beams. He walked slowly, not knowing, even here, what might be waiting for him, and his naked feet left their imprint in the thick carpet of dust, a giant among the pygmy trails that marked the passage of minute life. He went into the vestry, and it was here that horror put on a new face and shot out a cold fist that hit him in the stomach. The vestry was lit by a single plain glass window, miraculously unbroken, and through this the moon sent a bright beam of light that illuminated a small oak table and a high-backed armchair. Seated at the table, dressed in a black dust-coated cassock, was a grinning skeleton. In places the skin hung in wrinkled folds, and on the skull was a meagre mop of white hair. But otherwise it was a collection of white bones that glimmered softly through rents in the tattered cassock. It leant sideways, and was only held in position by the chair arm. One bony hand still lay on the table, but a few inches from a dust-covered book and an old-fashioned quill pen. When the effects of shock died away, Gerald forced his legs to move across the vestry, because, for no reason he could bring to mind, it seemed an important thing to do. He leaned over the table and pulled the book towards him. The skeleton appeared to nod as though in approval, then, possibly disturbed even by this slight movement, slid sideways and fell with an awful clattering sound to the floor. It was some while before Gerald was able to look for candles, but he finally found some in an unlocked cupboard, together with a number of moth-holed cassocks and a box of long sulphur matches. When he had lit the candles and the most wearable cassock had given at least the illusion of warmth to his chilled body, he pulled a stall up to the now vacated table and opened the book. Half the pages appeared to be filled with clerical engagements, baptisms, weddings, funerals. They were all there. But Gerald turned the pages over impatiently, and it was on the last, under the date 21st June 1872, that he found what he had been unconsciously looking for. The candles flickered as he read, casting shadows, shuddering over the yellowed paper and the thick, faded writing. Even as I write, I can hear their howls. Almighty God, if you still live, listen to the prayer of your miserable servant, and give him the power to set down the unthinkable evil I have witnessed. Although whether any eyes than mine will ever read these words is unlikely, for there seems no way to leave or enter this village. And I have tried. I must believe that we have been forsaken by God and man and handed over body and soul to the evil one. Lord, have mercy, mercy, for our sins are black and we have wandered from thy ways. Amen. My flock was small, but 55 souls, and now they have gone, and I, an old man, by virtue of this hallowed place, still live. We should have destroyed the first one, crushed it underfoot, burnt its foul carcass, and tossed the ashes to the winds. But may I be forgiven, did implore mercy for the creature that bore a semblance to man, when it squatted on a tombstone and did gibber upon us. I took it into my house and washed away the filth and clad it in clean raiment, and laid it on a soft bed, all as instructed by Holy Scripture. Where did I sin, merciful God? For should we not succour the afflicted, give good for evil? Then one night, when the moon was full, I saw it, cursed be the eyes that see, the ears that hear, feeding in the churchyard, mud on the hands, sitting on a pile of earth and gnawing. We chased it away and sent for the constable, but he was a man of little sense and did not believe. For the one we drove away, 12 did return, and they danced round the village bounds, and since that day no mortal soul has come in or gone out. I am weak, for I have not eaten these many days, so what I have to tell must be written quickly. Others of their kind come in once a year when the moon is full, and its light streams in through the north window. This I have noted. Should, by God's infinite mercy, one who has escaped them read these words, pay heed. Take the crucifix from the altar, for they fear it. And when the full moon paints a silver streak on the aisle beside the third pew from the chancel, then go you forth. Hold the crucifix on high and run. If you hold your soul dear, run, and if God be with you, the barrier may be crossed. Their howls are louder, and I hear screams. Lighten thou my darkness, I beseech you, O Lord, for I am lost in the valley of darkness. There was a blot after the last word, followed by a thick, straggling line which suggested the pen had dropped from fingers too weak to hold it. Gerald got up and, leaving the book open upon the table, ran into the church and sat down in the third pew. He remained there for several hours, anxiously watching the yellow streak of moonlight as it crept slowly down the chancel and along the aisle. It came as far as the second pew and then began to fade as the moon moved gradually to the east. Tomorrow night, if the old man had not been mad, and if he had got his facts right, there were so many ifs, tomorrow night he would make his very last bid for freedom. The moonlight died. Darkness closed in, and despite the constant presence of terror, Gerald fell into a dreamless sleep. He was awakened by sunlight and birdsong. The church, flooded with golden light, looked even more desolate and sinister than it had the night before. The ever-moving spirals of dust whirled and leaped across the floor like minute, restless ghosts. The altar drapes twisted and flapped, the vestry door opened and closed, while its oiled, starved hinges groaned and moved in protest. In striking contrast to all this gloom was the army of birds that swooped and dived among the roof beams and sent out a chorus of twittering, whistling, and early morning song that under the circumstances was rather distracting. Gerald could not dismiss a ridiculous notion that they resented his intrusion and were loudly proclaiming his presence. A black starling alighted on a pew back and examined him with bright, inquisitive eyes. Then, as though not at all reassured by what it saw, gave a startled cry and flew swiftly towards the altar. Gerald rose and stretched his aching limbs. He was stiff, cold, and now he came to consider the matter very hungry, and wondered if and when Luna would bring him some food. He climbed up onto a pew seat and peered cautiously out of an empty window frame. His range of view included most of the churchyard and one side of the Lough Inn, and his morale was not improved when he saw his own freshly turned grave. The ghouls, and he shuddered when this designation slipped uninvited across his brain, had not struck him as being particularly intelligent. But even the dimmest must surely soon realise that that which had been put in had unaccountably come out. As though to substantiate this belief, the child suddenly ran out from beside the inn and went leaping across the churchyard, looking like a particularly unpleasant species of monkey on its way to a bone-picking session. It reached Gerald's one-time grave, and after dancing round it with joyous anticipation, suddenly dropped down on all fours. The monkey image was now replaced by that of a vicious dog, which has conceived the well-founded suspicion that it has been robbed of a sucking bone. This conception was dramatically enhanced when the child began to claw at the disturbed grave with both hands and toss up the earth in a frenzy of excitement. An agitated beaver could not have done a better job. Gerald watched the displaced earth grow higher, and the head and shoulders of the burrowing child go lower until all he could see was a skinny rump and a pair of jerking legs. Suddenly it sprang upright, and after giving vent to a harsh and prolonged howl, went bounding across the churchyard towards the inn. Gerald did not have to wait long. In no time at all, a crowd of gesturing, prancing, clearly unhappy figures were congregating round his grave and appeared to be accusing the innkeeper of some misdemeanour. That personage apparently did not believe what he could not feel, for he flung himself down to the ground and plunged his arm into the loosed soil. Gerald thought he looked like a plumber trying to remove an obstruction from a choked manhole. His probing efforts clearly confirmed everyone's worst suspicions, and when the innkeeper had regained his feet, the incriminating argument broke out again, and was only terminated by the childlike child screaming some unintelligible words and pointing towards the church. Gerald fled to the vestry, where he barricaded the door and prayed for nothing to happen. The ensuing silence was more nerve-wracking than a chorus of voices demanding, allegorically speaking, his blood, and presently, finding his prayer appeared to have been answered, he unbarricaded the door and crept back into the church. Finding it empty, he walked boldly down the aisle and peered out into the sunlit road. There was absolutely no doubt that the Gauls entertained a respectable fear for the church and its immediate vicinity. Gerald counted 7 of them leaning against the inn wall, and although his appearance caused an unwelcome stir of interest, not one attempted to approach the church. Dinner stood looking at prospective diners, and for the time being there appeared to be no prospect of either making contact with the other. In consequence, Gerald felt a heartening revival of confidence and decided to try an interesting experiment. He walked swiftly to the altar and was delighted to find a tall processional cross leaning up against the left-hand wall. He wiped away the worst of the dust with his cassock sleeve, and then held it on high and marched with a due solemnity back to the front door. His reappearance was greeted with a prolonged howl, and the Gauls hastily averted their faces and jog-trotted back into the inn. Gerald, whose to date only close-up view of the cross had been on a hot cross bun, decided this one would never leave his side. And it had more protective value than a loaded brain gun. It was possibly an hour later when he heard a series of gasping screams, and looking out he saw Luna suddenly emerge from the inn door carrying a heavy iron saucepan in one hand and a tablespoon in the other. She ran towards the church, hotly pursued by the innkeeper who was brandishing a stout stick, while the remainder of the ghoulish crew remained clustered around the doorway where they encouraged their leader with advisory howls. Gerald seized the processional cross and waved it wildly back and forth in an effort to assist the pursued and check the pursuer. He succeeded on both counts. The innkeeper stumbled and appeared to be in some distress, then shrieked when he saw the cross which Gerald was waving with more fervour than reverence. Luna passed through the doorway while her terrified sire trotted back to the gesturing group of Gauls. She placed the saucepan down on the front pew, then settled herself and raised tearful eyes to the young man, who was more concerned with the steaming stew than her distress. "Dada beat me, because they say I cut you loose, so I take part and come here, I'll not go back." "Oh dear." Gerald took a seat beside the saucepan and looked meaningfully at the battered spoon. "Sorry if I got you into trouble. Is it rabbit stew again?" "No." She dabbed her eyes and sniffed. "Small animals and birds." "Oh. There will be much anger because I have taken it." "Yes, I expect there will be." Gerald paused before allowing hunger to overcome restraint. "We mustn't let it grow cold. Are you hungry?" Luna shook her head. "I ate this morning. For you." Gerald seized the spoon, and such is the nature of man, far from feeling any sense of gratitude for this act of devotion, he experienced a twinge of irritation because she had not brought something to drink. The girl sat and stared wistfully at the north window, in which a few fragments of stained glass still remained, and occasionally sighed deeply and loudly as though to draw attention to her distress. When his hunger had been appeased, Gerald laid down the spoon and looked at her with some concern. "Look here, you mustn't give way, you know. Did he hurt you?" Now tears seeped from the beautiful eyes, and Gerald felt some surprise that what was she? A Humgoo could cry like a normal human being. Despite her undoubted beauty, he could not forget her relationship to the things whose culinary designs on his person was still a matter of fearful concern. She poured a torrent of words, using the full extent of her limited vocabulary, in an effort to make him understand. "You no care if I be hurt or not. I own the animal who cut ropes, bring food. If you go, Luna will be left behind, and you not care if bad things be done to her." This was so near the truth, conscience stirred and put a gentle tone in his voice. "Nonsense. I'm very, very grateful for what you have done, and when I escape, you must come with me. You must leave this place and live like a pretty girl should." She stifled a sob and turned to face him, with a face which was lit by a dawning smile of delight. "You take me outside, and I wear clothes like yours? Better! You'll be able to have some nice dresses from Marks and Spencer's, and wear shoes and stockings and watch television. You can't imagine what it will be like." She jumped up and down on the hard seat in childish delight, and Gerald wondered wryly how the monsters here would compare with those she would meet on the outside. You really take me outside? I do all the things you say and ride on the tube? Good heavens, what do you know about tube trains? Her smile was that of a beautiful, innocent child. Elders say they're much good eating on tube. Whatever retort Gerald might have made to this statement was cancelled by a whirling sound as a stone flew in through the open door and crashed against the Chancellor's step. He jumped to his feet as Luna grasped his arm. Do not go near door. They use throwing sling and stone. Kill if it hit head. They kill many animals that way. Another stone the size of a fist came in through a side window and chipped a fragment of wood from a pew back. Gerald grabbed the girl round the waist and half dragged and half carried her into the vestry, where he shut the door and retreated into a far corner. Then he turned to Luna. How long will this go on? She shrugged. Not long. They not like long after and will soon be tired. They wait for elders to come for great eating. Elders not like us have much wisdom. Gerald swallowed and forced himself to ask the question. The great is that tonight? She nodded. Elders bring in special things, and there be much dancing round fire in Harvest Place. We go before elders come. No escape when elders here. They have great magic and kill with bang. Fine. Gerald nodded grimly. That's all I needed. A pack of gun-toting Gauls. Well, it seems the stone-throwing session is over for the time being, so I guess we had better try to get some sleep and get our strength up for a lot of running. She giggled and looked at him shyly from under long lashes. You talk funny. Lots of words which I do not understand. But I do all things you say. You say sleep, Luna sleep. You say Luna wait and run, I wait and run. Good girl. You do what I tell you and we'll get out of here somehow. There was something terribly pathetic in the way she accepted his assurance with simple, unquestioning faith and obeyed his instructions with almost cheerful obedience. She sat down on the dust-covered floor in one corner of the room and was instantly asleep. Gerald sat watching her for some time and wondered how she would fare if they run free and reached his workaday world, where the only Gauls he knew were confined to property speculators' offices and great eatings to businessmen's lunches. Then he heard another stone rattle across the church floor, and fear flared up in him to drive all but the immediate future from his mind. The day passed slowly and a fresh spectre came to haunt the little room. Suppose there was no moon tonight and he was unable to judge the exact time when it would be safe for them to run from the church. He looked anxiously out of the small window. So far he could see there was no sign of cloud, but there was still 8 or 9 hours before the moon would be in a position to advance a beam of light to a point in line with a third pew. One worry begat another. The Gauls, at least the adult ones, did not strike him as being fond of exercise. But how fast could they run when proposed nourishment was going all out for wide open spaces? Also, and Gerald experienced a new kind of shudder, a hail of well-aimed stones could bring him down before he had run 2 steps. He would have to run fast, weave from side to side and take advantage of every inch of cover, and all the time be hampered by the presence of a girl. Such was his fear, he even considered the possibility of leaving her behind. Then he remembered that he would not be free now, but for her courageous act of cutting him loose, and knew, whatever the cost, they would leave together. He too was asleep when the sun set, and awoke in total darkness, save for the reflection of dancing flames which flickered over the far wall. Gerald jumped to his feet and after climbing up on the bench peered out of the vestry window. An immense fire was blazing away on the edge of the churchyard. They, and this seemed to be a natural appellation, were feeding the fire with dead wood, which was being dragged from the nearby woods, Gerald watched the grotesque figures as they struggled with rotting branches, wrestled with young trees, saw the shower of sparks that rose up to the night sky as each offering was flung onto the flames. A motley collection of chairs and tables had been arranged in a rough circle round the fire. Thus, and Gerald found he had the courage to face the facts squarely, creating an open-air dining hall, which must be a very necessary part of the forthcoming proceedings. He looked anxiously up at the sky. Heavy cloud banks drifted like prowling ghost hounds across the face of the moon, so at times its silver light was shut off and the dancing flames of the bonfire took on a deeper, more sinister glow, while the moving figures threw long shadows that writhed and caracoled among the tombstones. Gerald climbed down from the bench and, after locating the shadowy figure of Luna, gently laid a hand on her shoulder. He whispered, "Luna, wake up! It's almost time to go." Like a young animal, she was instantly awake and sat looking up at him, her face a white blur in the semi-gloom. "We run now?" The question was asked in her usual husky voice, and he could detect no undertone of doubt or fear. He felt the now familiar twinge of irritation when he realised the full extent of her complete faith in his ability to get them both through this time of intense and unthinkable danger. This was followed by a surge of unexpected pity as he took her outstretched hands and pulled her gently upright. "I think so. Look, they have a fire burning out there, and I saw a lot of chairs and tables. Have you any idea how much longer it will be before anything happens?" Luna climbed up onto the bench and was looking out over the churchyard. Then she got down and put her head over to one side, and he thought how young she looked. "Not yet. They have to wash in river and put on other clothes for great eating. The elders likes us all to be clean, no stink." Gerald nodded his approval and decided the unknown elders might be monsters, but at least they were fastidious monsters. "We must go into the church. Big house," he said. "Then, when time is right, we will go out." She nodded and waited for him to open the door before walking out into the main body of the church, which was, to Gerald's horror, in complete darkness. "When the moon, the big night light, shines through the window," he whispered, "and reaches here," he groped for the third pew, "then we must run. But the clouds are stopping the light from coming in." "Then we go now." "No," he shook his head violently. "If the road is not open, then they will catch up with us. But if the moon does not come out soon, then I will have to guess when the time is right, and hope for the best." They waited and listened to the chorus of howls that seemed to be part of the general air of festivity. Once a stone came hurtling through the doorway, but Gerald thought it had only been thrown as an act of bravado, or as a reminder that he had not been forgotten, rather than as an act of aggression. "I not worry," Luna's voice tried to comfort him. "We run fast and get through." He choked back an outburst of fearful doubts, and instead patted her shoulder approvingly. "That's the spirit! You must think of all the wonderful times you'll have when we get out of this place." He heard her sigh of contentment, and would have elaborated on the joys to come had not the moon chosen that moment to emerge from behind a drifting cloud. The beam of light glided down the chancel, flowed over the single step, and did not stop until it reached the third pew. Gerald gasped, then shook his head in disbelief. "Talk about a bloody miracle! Where's that damn cross?" He stumbled round in the half-light looking for the mislaid cross, and finally stumbled over it, measuring his length on the floor as though in retaliation for either irreverence or carelessness. He took a firm grip of the polished wood and whispered his final instructions. "Keep close behind me and don't fall behind. Can you run fast?" "As a rabbit when chased by Dada," she announced, and Gerald groaned. "I hope to hell I can run." "Ready? You say run, we run." He led her out into the church porch and caught his breath in dismay. Although the majority of the Gauls were occupied with preparing for the forthcoming feast, they had not neglected to post sentries in the church. 4 of the sinister figures, now clad in clean white nightgowns, were lined up by the inn wall and came to instant lively attention. when Gerald and his companion appeared. Gerald took a deep breath and shouted, "Run!" With cross held high, yelling at the top of his voice and running as he had never run before, Gerald and the girl Humgoo streaked out into the moonlight, the 4 sentries scattered before them like leaves buffeted by a mischievous wind, while screaming their alarm to the main pack around the bonfire. The inn was past, the line of cottages became a menacing row of burrows from which disaster might emerge at any moment. Then they too slipped into what has been and were replaced by low hedgerows and wide open meadows that stretched out gently to rolling hills. Presently Gerald dared to look back and received an instant incentive to quicken his pace. The entire pack were less than 100 yards behind, running shoulder to shoulder, wedged so tightly together in the narrow lane they resembled an avalanche of snow that must crush anything or anyone that stood in its path. Suddenly a stone went hissing past Gerald's head, and he had time to marvel at the speed and velocity with which it travelled. His terror reached a new dimension when the missile crashed into a tree and became embedded into the smooth grey trunk, so that his unprotected back became an expanse of quivering flesh that anticipated a resounding thud and the ensuing agony long before it arrived. When a stone glanced off his right shoulder, it came almost as a relief. Now he need no longer imagine the pain was excruciating, but not unbearable, and was followed by a merciful numbness that left his right arm limp and caused him to drop the processional cross. A loud howling from his rear announced the pack's displeasure at this temporary obstruction to progress, which resulted in a temporary respite from the hissing stones. But the girl who ran beside him with smooth, effortless strides gasped when he involuntarily cried out and said, "You hurt, must not stop, not very far now." The lane gradually curved so that for a brief while they were hidden from the reassembled pack, but Gerald was not far from complete exhaustion, and there was a feeling that surrender would be preferable to the agony of labouring lungs and tortured throat, not to mention sore, naked feet. His pace automatically slackened, but Luna grabbed his arm. "No, stop! We are there, look!" Even before he had finished speaking, he saw the other road. The lane still continued to curve, and if followed would have undoubtedly led back to the village, but running at right angles to it was a broader road that shimmered faintly through a thin mist. Understanding came to Gerald, and the words "mind conditioning," "hypnotic blindness," flashed across his mind as with renewed energy as he ran towards the bridge that spanned the gulf which separated fantastic from commonplace. When the full moon was in a certain position, you were temporarily permitted to see. The road to freedom was only a few steps away when the grisly hunters came round the curve, and their anger was expressed by a storm of hideous howls which could be likened to that of a pack of starving wolves who see their quarry escaping. The stones flew again, but now the aim was far from accurate, which suggested the hunters were as near exhaustion as the hunted. But one missile found its mark. Gerald heard a sickening thud and felt Luna's hand wrenched from his as the girl went hurling to the ground. Every instinct told him to leave her, to go on running until he was safely beyond the barrier of misty moonlight. But another emotion that so far had not entered his pampered, sated life made him stop and grip the back of the girl's gown. Regardless of the menacing stones, howling monsters and protesting bodies, he dragged her onto the side road, through the mist to finally collapse where he reached a spot some 20 yards beyond. There he lay and looked back down the road. Apart from a patch of silver mist, there was nothing to distinguish it from a million other roads that interlaced rural England. Nothing, that is to say, if the group of white-clad figures could be ignored. Gerald had time to wonder what superstition or taboo made it impossible for them to advance through the mist barrier, before a groan from Luna made him forget all the need to comfort. With his one good arm, he eased her onto the grass verge and smoothed the tangled hair from her pale forehead. She smiled up at him and pressed his hand against her cheek. Her voice was faint, but every word was distinct and became an arrow of remorse. "I hurt bad. Feel nothing from waist down. Back broke like when Dad hit Rabbit." He shook his head. "Nonsense, you'll be all right. I'll go and fetch help." She gripped his hand so tight he flinched. "No, do not leave me. Rabbit die soon when back broke. I die soon. We'll never see outside and wear clothes like yours. Never wear clothes from Marks and Spencer's." he prompted gently, and cursed himself for such stupid, unfeeling flippancy. It is better so. I would never be anything to you but an animal. No, he shouted the denial, but even as he did so, knew there was some truth to the accusation. I never thought of you like that. She pulled his hand to her lips and caressed it softly. Do you like your little Humgoo a little? Just a little? Little? A lot! I like you. I love you a lot. For the last time her face was lit up by a joyful smile, and she kissed his fingers while the young man tried to suppress an involuntary shudder. Humgoo, half and half, but one half belong to you. The last words ended in a sigh that drifted away on the night breeze, and Gerald disengaged his hand from the now limp grip and closed the staring eyes. He sat and looked at the dead face for a little while and remembered that unfamiliar word, Humgoo. It sounded like a breed of horse, or maybe a pedigree dog, but a horse would neigh with pleasure when sighting its owner, and a dog could lick the hand of its master, and love of a kind could be transmitted through the barrier which divides king from subject. Such was the love he felt for the pathetic but still lovely corpse that lay before him. Then he remembered that danger still gibbered, gestured and howled but 30 yards away, and rising to his feet, walked quickly away. Luna rested by the roadside, a sad reminder that oil should not flirt with flame. Gerald walked for an hour, or at least so it seemed. For road crossed road, turnings met crossroads, and he might have been the last man on earth, wandering in a moonlit maze. Then he heard the roar of traffic, and his strength returned in a last strong flow, so that he was able to break into a stumbling, painful but joyous run. He came out of a narrow lane into a wide motorway, and the joy, the blessed relief, was such that he stood for a moment drinking in this glorious sight, while tears ran down his haggard face. He was free! He shouted the word several times, free, 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 and several youths on motorcycles whistled at him, being apparently under the impression that he was drunk. And so he was. Drunk on the wine of life, intoxicated on the heady spirit called, he jumbled a mass of words together and came up with the right ones, naked sight. He was seeing the world as it really was for the first time. A place of beautiful motor cars, bright lights, wonderful petrol fumes, exquisite roaring cars, all of which were gloriously breaking the speed limit, and nowhere was there a sight or smell of a ghoul. He ran, skipped, danced, and sometimes walked along the road, and presently his joy was crowned by the sight of 2 stationary vehicles. One was a very large, very shiny, and no doubt very expensive Rolls-Royce, thrice blessed that be that name, and the other was an equally large, plain black van. When he drew nearer to this sight, he was able to count 7 people clustered round the Rolls-Royce, all of whom appeared to be in a state of great agitation. "Godfrey, how much longer are you going to be?" inquired a beautiful young woman in a fur coat. "We're late as it is." A tall man in a black overcoat and a white muffler closed the bonnet and wiped his hands on a silk handkerchief. "No longer at all. Finished. The old spark plugs were playing up. If you'll pile in, we'll be on our way." "You'll have to step on it," a short youth in a hideous green overcoat observed. "You know what happens." The man who had been addressed as Godfrey smiled derisively. "My dear Tony, if you will get back to the goodies van and stop bleating like a demented sheep, no more time will be lost." Gerald coughed and made his presence known. "Excuse me, I wonder if you'd be so kind as to give me a lift." Godfrey swung round and took in the bedraggled cassock and bare feet of this petitioner for free transportation with an expression of comical surprise. "Would you believe it, a tattered priest? Have you met with an accident, or are you performing a penance?" Gerald hastened to make the situation clear, particularly as certain members of the party were looking at him with some distaste. "I'm not a priest. I've met with a sort of accident, and I want to report it to the authorities as soon as possible." Godfrey frowned. "Well, this is by way of being a club outing, and we are rather late for a bit of a do. But I dare say we can drop you at the end of the motorway." "But we're over an hour late," protested Tony. "Then 10 minutes more won't make all that difference," Godfrey stated. Right in, everyone, and you, sir, if you don't mind squeezing in between Daphne and myself on the front seat, will be away. 3 elegant gentlemen seated themselves in the rear of the car. Tony and another man went back to the black van, and Gerald was sandwiched between Godfrey and Daphne on the front seat. Car and van glided away down the motorway. It is unfortunate that Gerald felt a great urge to communicate his recent experiences to a receptive ear. Look! His voice boomed out in the enclosed space and was perfectly audible to even the passengers on the back seat. You won't believe this, but I haven't really been in an accident. I lost myself and landed up in a weird village. For a while Gerald wondered if anyone had heard or understood his announcement, for the silence was absolute save for the gentle purr of the car engine. He decided to elaborate further. An awful place inhabited by... I know you'll think I'm stark raving mad. Inhabited by ghouls. Godfrey made utterance. You don't say. Yes, I don't blame you for doubting me. If a chap had told me yesterday that there was anywhere on earth where you could be buried alive, then dug up for what they call this you won't believe this, the Great Eating, I'd have called the nearest copper. Godfrey nodded slowly, as though coming to a sudden decision, swung the car into a side road. Gerald recognised it as the one from which he had recently emerged. He voiced his objection. I say, you've left the motorway. Godfrey looked out of the side window, then consulted the driving mirror. Una, I do believe you're right. A dreadful suspicion rummaged around among a host of newly aroused fears and suddenly grew and became a certainty. His question was rather superfluous. You're not? Godfrey nodded. Yes, we are. Jolly old elders taking in some goodies for their yokels. I say, this isn't your lucky night, is it? Gerald began to struggle and Godfrey smiled. Daphne, my love. Yes, Godfrey. Have you still got the shooting iron in your bag? Yes, Godfrey. Then get it out, there's a good girl, and poke it into this blighter's ribs. He might break something. Daphne obliged, and Gerald surrendered his body and soul to the inevitable. He began to sob like a frightened child. Cheer up, Godfrey instructed. After all, you are coming back in style. I can't wait to see their simple, honest faces when you step out into the moonlight. I always find it pays to pamper the lower orders, just as long as you don't overdo it. Daphne fingered Gerald's arm. When he's had time to mature, he'll be a treat. The hedgerows flashed by, and the full moon smiled benignly down on sleeping fields and murmuring trees. It also gently caressed the face of Luna, as she lay, silent and still by the roadside, and painted a silver sheen on her wind-ruffled hair.